The wind hit 100 miles per hour on February 11, 1899, and Henrik Larsen watched through his small window as James Corbett's cabin collapsed under the weight of snow and ice less than 2 miles down the valley. Inside his own structure, with its strange, curved walls that every trapper had mocked for 3 years, Henrik felt nothing but warmth and stillness while the worst blizzard in recorded American history tried and failed to kill him. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if engineering stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale of frontier innovation is even more impossible than this one. The cabin door wouldn't close. Thomas Wickham pushed against it with his full weight, but the wind outside had other plans. It was November 16, 1896. And the first serious storm of the season had arrived 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Henrik Larsen knelt by their fireplace, feeding split wood into flames that barely warmed the small space. The walls around them creaked with each gust, logs shifting against each other in ways that made Henrik deeply uncomfortable. They had built this cabin the previous spring using standard methods: notched corners, vertical log walls, mud chinking, a simple plank door hung on leather hinges. It had taken them 5 days working together, and they had been proud of the result. Most trappers in the Montana Rockies built similar structures. The design was proven over decades of frontier use. It kept out rain and provided shelter from wind. That was supposed to be enough. The storm had started around noon with light snow. By evening, the wind had increased to the point where standing upright outside required effort. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to what Henrik estimated was 20 below zero, possibly colder. The wind didn't just blow, it hammered against the cabin walls with a physical force that made the entire structure shudder. Henrik had experienced bad weather before during his 7 years trapping in the Rockies, but this felt different. This felt malicious. Thomas finally got the door closed and dropped the wooden bar into its brackets. He turned back toward the fire, breathing hard. "Frame's bowing," he said. Snow covered his beard and coat. Wood's contracting in the cold, gaps getting wider. Henrik stood and examined the doorframe. Thomas was right. The vertical logs that formed the frame had pulled inward slightly, creating a gap nearly half an inch wide along one side. Wind whistled through it, and snow was already accumulating on the floor beneath. "We can pack it with cloth," Henrik said, temporarily. They spent the next hour stuffing rags and spare clothing into the gap. It helped, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. The cabin wasn't built for this level of sustained wind and cold. The walls themselves were moving, not catastrophically, but enough that Henrik could see gaps opening between logs where the chinking had been tight that morning. Cold air poured through those gaps. The fire consumed wood at an alarming rate just to maintain a temperature that kept them from freezing. Around midnight, Thomas stood abruptly. "Something's wrong with the north wall," he said. Henrik followed his gaze. The entire north-facing wall, which took the brunt of the wind, was bowing inward. Not much, perhaps 2 inches at the center, but visible. The logs were flexing under the sustained pressure. Henrik had never seen that happen before. They moved their supplies away from that wall, piling everything near the south side of the cabin. The fire continued to burn, but the interior temperature kept dropping despite their efforts. Henrik's breath was visible in the firelight. Thomas wrapped himself in both their blankets and sat close to the flames. "We'll be all right," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Storm will break by morning." It didn't break by morning. It intensified. Thomas Wickham died at dawn on November 17th. He had gone outside during a brief lull in the wind to reinforce the doorframe from the exterior. The storm resumed with sudden violence while he was working. Henrik watched through the gap in the door as Thomas tried to make it back. He collapsed 15 feet from the entrance. By the time Henrik could secure the interior and get outside, Thomas was already unconscious. Henrik dragged him inside, but the hypothermia had progressed too far. Thomas never regained consciousness. Henrik buried him 3 days later when the storm finally ended. He found a spot on a hillside overlooking their trap lines and marked it with stones. Then he returned to the damaged cabin and spent the rest of that winter learning everything he could about how structures failed. He visited every trapper camp within 20 miles. Most men thought he was still processing grief and tolerated his questions. Henrik examined their cabins with obsessive attention. He documented how wind damage appeared on walls. He noted where chinking failed first. He measured how much walls could bow before structural collapse became inevitable. Every cabin he visited showed the same weaknesses. Vertical flat walls caught wind like sails. Notched corners concentrated stress at specific points. Standard construction methods created structures that fought against weather rather than working with it. When he wasn't visiting other camps, Henrik studied natural formations. He spent hours watching how snowdrifts formed around boulders compared to trees. Smooth, rounded surfaces caused snow to slide away or accumulate in predictable patterns. Flat, vertical surfaces caught drifting snow and held it, building weight and pressure. He observed wind patterns around different shapes. A flat cliff face created turbulence and updrafts. A rounded boulder split wind smoothly, sending it around and over with minimal direct impact. Henrik examined every curved object he could find: overturned boats stored for winter, barrels left outside trading posts, even the natural curve of bent trees under snow load. He began to understand something that other trappers never considered. Flat surfaces were easy to build, but they were terrible at handling extreme weather. Curves required more effort to construct, but they redirected force instead of absorbing it. By spring of 1897, Henrik had filled a notebook with sketches and observations. Other trappers saw him drawing curved lines and measuring angles with strings tied to stakes. James Corbett, an experienced trapper who had survived 15 winters in the Rockies, told everyone at the spring rendezvous that Henrik had lost his mind to grief. "Man's drawing circles in the dirt and talking about barrel houses," Corbett said. "Next he'll be building pyramids." Henrik didn't argue. He sold his winter's fur take, bought supplies, and returned to the mountains. He had 9 months before the next serious winter. That was enough time to test whether his ideas about curved walls and redirected force could be translated from theory into actual construction. If he was wrong, he would waste a season and endure more mockery. If he was right, he would never watch another partner die 15 feet from safety. Henrik arrived at the settlement in late June of 1897 with a list of supplies that made no sense to anyone. Margaret Evanston, who ran the trading post, read it twice before looking up at him. "You want 40 feet of milled lumber in graduated widths, specialized angle saws, and 3 times the usual nails?" she asked. "What exactly are you building?" Henrik spread his sketches on the counter. "A cabin with curved walls," he said, "like a barrel lying on its side." Word spread through the settlement within hours. By evening, a dozen trappers had gathered at the trading post to examine Henrik's drawings and offer their opinions. James Corbett arrived late, looked at the sketches for perhaps 30 seconds, and laughed loud enough that everyone in the room turned to look at him. "You're going to curve the walls?" Corbett said. "Larson, you know how long that'll take? You know how much lumber you'll waste cutting angles? This is the dumbest thing I've seen in 20 years on the frontier." Henrik had expected this reaction. "Flat walls catch wind direct," he said. "Curved walls deflect it. Snow slides off curves, piles up against flat surfaces." "Snow piles up everywhere in winter," Corbett said. "That's what snow does. You build walls thick enough and chink them proper, they hold. Been doing it that way since Daniel Boone. You think you're smarter than every trapper who ever lived?" Other men joined the criticism. William Cross, a homesteader who had built 3 cabins in the territory, pointed out that curved construction would create gaps that couldn't be chinked properly. Daniel Moss, barely 20 years old, but already on his 3rd winter, said the whole idea looked like something a man would build if he'd never actually worked with wood. Even younger trappers who hadn't known Thomas Wickham suggested that Henrik was letting grief cloud his judgment. Margaret Evanston stayed quiet until the crowd dispersed. Then she helped Henrik load his supplies onto his pack horse. "They said the same things about stone foundations when someone first suggested those," she said, "and covered wells, and a dozen other things that work now." "You think this'll work?" Henrik asked. "I think you watched your partner die because a cabin wall couldn't handle wind," Margaret said. "I think you've spent 6 months studying why that happened. That's more thought than most men put into anything. Maybe you're wrong, maybe you're right, but you're not crazy." Henrik paid for his supplies and left the settlement before dawn the next morning. Behind him, James Corbett was already telling stories about Larson's circus tent. Within a week, every trapper within 50 miles had heard about the barrel cabin. Most thought it was a joke. Some thought it was sad. Henrik didn't care anymore what they thought. He had 11 weeks before a first snow. He needed to start building. Henrik selected his building site in mid-July of 1897. The location sat on elevated ground 200 yards from the creek where he ran his trap lines. Most trappers built near water for convenience. Henrik built for wind patterns and drainage. He had spent 3 days studying how air moved across this particular hillside during storms. The spot he chose sat just below the ridgeline where wind would pass overhead rather than striking directly. The foundation took 2 weeks. Henrik cut 8 logs, each 14 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. He stripped them completely and shaped them into skids using a draw knife borrowed from the trading post. He arranged these skids parallel to each other, spacing them 18 inches apart. The entire platform would raise his cabin 3 feet off the ground. Other trappers left their cabins sitting directly on earth. Henrik understood that ground cold traveled upward through floors and rotted bottom logs within 5 years. The elevated foundation would prevent both problems. On August 1st, he began the curved wall construction. This was where theory had to become physical reality. Henrik had calculated the curve using a method he had devised with rope and stakes. He wanted walls that bowed outward 18 inches from true vertical over a 6-foot height. Not a perfect semicircle, but a gentle convex arc that would deflect wind while remaining structurally sound. The first timber layer went down easily. It sat flat on the platform foundation, forming a rectangular base 12 feet by 16 feet. The second layer required precision. Henrik had cut each timber with a barely perceptible angle on its bottom edge. When placed on the first layer, this angle caused the timber to tilt outward by roughly 2 degrees. The effect was invisible to casual observation, but critical to the overall curve. By the third layer, the outward bow became noticeable. By the 5th layer, it was obvious. Each timber required individual angle cutting because the curve changed as the wall rose. Henrik spent hours with his measuring strings, checking and rechecking before making each cut. A mistake would compromise the entire structure. There was no room for approximation. The physical work was punishing. Each timber weighed between 80 and 120 pounds. Henrik worked alone, using a ramp system he had built to roll timbers up to their positions. He cut mortise joints at the curves to corners where walls met, then pinned them with wooden pegs driven through holes he had drilled. The technique was slower than traditional notching, but created connections that couldn't shift under pressure. By mid-September, he had completed 6 layers on all 4 walls. The barrel shape was unmistakable now. The walls curved outward gracefully, creating a structure that looked more like a boat hull than a cabin. Henrik stood back and examined his work. It looked strange. It looked impractical. It looked like nothing else in the Montana Territory. James Corbett rode past one afternoon, stopped long enough to shake his head, and rode on without speaking. Henrik returned to work. He had 4 more layers to complete before first snow. The first snow arrived on October 3, 1897. Henrik had 10 layers of curved timbers in place, reaching roughly 5 feet of height. He worked through the light snowfall, fitting the 11th layer while wearing gloves that made precise cuts difficult. The weather was mild for early October, temperatures staying near 20 degrees during the day. Henrik knew this was borrowed time. Serious cold would arrive within weeks. Each timber layer required increasingly complex angle cutting. As the walls curved outward, the bottom edge of each timber needed a steeper angle to maintain the arc. Henrik had developed a system using 2 guide strings stretched from corner stakes. He aligned each timber against these strings before marking his cuts. The process was tedious. A single timber could take 4 hours from initial measurement to final placement. The air pockets created between imperfectly mating curved surfaces had become obvious as the walls rose. Where timbers bowed outward, tiny gaps appeared between layers. Henrik had initially worried these would create drafts, but he realized they served a purpose. Trapped air provided insulation more effectively than solid wood. He began deliberately leaving small spaces where the curve was most pronounced, planning to seal only the largest gaps with chinking. By late November, all 4 walls reached their full height of 7 feet. The barrel profile was complete. The structure looked absurd from a distance, like someone had built a cabin from boat parts. Henrik's nearest neighbor, a trapper named Samuel Pike, visited during the first week of December. He walked around the structure twice without speaking, then stopped at the door opening. "You really think this'll work?" Pike asked. "Wind won't be able to push against it properly," Henrik said. "It'll deflect up and around instead of hitting flat." "Seems like a lot of faith in theory," Pike said. "What if you're wrong?" Henrik had asked himself that question hundreds of times during the past 5 months. He had invested his entire year's earnings in this construction. If the design failed, he would face winter in a structure that might prove worse than conventional building. But every time he doubted, he remembered Thomas Wickham's body frozen 15 feet from their cabin door. "Then I'll rebuild next spring," Henrik said. James Corbett arrived 3 days later with 2 other trappers. They stood outside the curved walls, making jokes loud enough for Henrik to hear clearly. Corbett called it a lumber graveyard. He said Henrik had proven that education and intelligence weren't the same thing. He predicted the first serious wind would peel those curved walls apart like peeling an apple. Henrik worked inside, fitting floorboards across the platform foundation. He could hear everything Corbett said. He didn't respond. The mockery didn't matter anymore. What mattered was completing the roof before serious storms arrived. He had perhaps 3 weeks of workable weather remaining. The roof would require another 2 weeks minimum. Henrik increased his work hours, building by lantern light when darkness came early. The curved walls stood solid around him. Everything now depended on getting a roof overhead before winter truly began. The roof construction began on December 20th, 1897. Henrik had cut ridge poles during November, selecting straight pines 8 inches in diameter. He notched these poles to sit securely across the top of his curved walls, spacing them 16 inches apart. The close spacing was intentional. The roof would support enormous weight once he added the sod layer. Standard construction used ridge poles spaced 24 inches or wider. Henrik needed stronger support. Across the ridge poles, he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. Each plank overlapped the one below it by 3 inches, creating a shingled pattern that would shed water. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles using wooden pins he had carved during evening hours throughout the fall. The work was slow and required constant climbing up and down his ladder. By Christmas, the plank layer was complete. The sod application took another full week. Henrik cut sections of prairie sod from a meadow half a mile away, hauling them on a makeshift sled. Each section was roughly 12 inches square and 4 inches thick. He laid them grass side up across the plank roof, overlapping edges to prevent gaps. The sod was heavy. By the time he finished, the roof carried an additional 2,000 pounds of earth and vegetation. The curved walls supported the weight without visible strain. Beneath the sod, the dried grass layer he had added provided immediate insulation. Above it, the living sod would root together over time, creating a waterproof membrane. Snow would accumulate on top during winter, adding yet another insulating layer. The entire roof system was designed to trap heat while shedding precipitation. It was overbuilt by any standard measure, but Henrik had learned that frontier survival required exceeding standards. The window installation came next. Henrik placed a single window high on the south wall, only 10 inches by 14 inches. The opening cut through one solid timber, avoiding any joint. He built a thick shutter from planks reinforced with iron brackets purchased at the trading post. The shutter could be barred from inside. Behind it, he fitted the window opening with oiled canvas stretched tight and sealed with pine resin. The canvas allowed diffused light while blocking wind completely. The door required 3 days of careful work. Henrik constructed it from 3-inch thick planks, using tongue and groove joints. He reinforced it with diagonal iron straps and hung it on heavy hinges mortised into the curved door frame. The door weighed nearly 80 pounds, but swung smoothly. A wooden beam lock connected the door directly to the wall structure when engaged. To force this door open, someone would need to destroy the wall itself. Inside, Henrik built a stone fireplace in the northwest corner. He gathered flat stones from the creek and constructed a proper firebox with a narrow chimney extending through the roof. The chimney design included a smoke shelf to prevent downdrafts. On January 15, 1898, Henrik lit his first fire in the completed cabin. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature reached 60 degrees despite outside air at -5. He used half the firewood he had burned daily in his previous cabin. Winter of 1898 proved frustratingly mild. Henrik had built his barrel-walled cabin to withstand catastrophic conditions, but the weather refused to cooperate. Temperatures dropped to -15 on the coldest nights. Wind occasionally gusted to 40 miles per hour. Snow accumulated to perhaps 3 feet by February. These were normal conditions for the Montana Rockies, nothing exceptional. Nothing that would prove or disprove Henrik's theories about curved walls and thermal efficiency, but the cabin performed remarkably well, even in moderate weather. Henrik discovered the thermos effect during his first week of occupancy. He would build a fire in the morning, let it burn for 2 hours, then let it die to coals. The interior temperature would remain stable for 6 to 8 hours afterward. His previous cabin had required constant fire maintenance to stay even marginally warm. The curved walls, thick sod roof, and elevated platform created an insulated capsule that retained heat with minimal fuel consumption. Henrik began measuring everything. He notched marks on a stick to track interior versus exterior temperatures. He counted how many logs he burned per day compared to previous winters. The results were dramatic. He was using roughly 60% less firewood while maintaining a warmer interior. The fuel savings alone would justify the construction effort within 3 winters. Other trappers noticed his reduced smoke output. James Corbett visited in February, claiming he wanted to check if Henrik was still alive since his chimney barely smoked. Henrik showed him inside. The cabin was warm despite only coals glowing in the fireplace. Corbett examined the curved walls from the interior, running his hand along the smooth timbers. "It's warm," Corbett admitted. "I'll give you that, but you built this thing for 14 months. I can build a standard cabin in a week. Sure, I burn more wood. Wood's free. Time isn't." "Time doesn't matter if you're dead," Henrik said. Corbett had no answer for that. He left without additional comment. Henrik visited Corbett's cabin a week later. The contrast was striking. Corbett's conventional structure had frost buildup on the interior walls near the corners. Cold drafts were visible in the way his lantern flame flickered. Corbett kept his fire roaring constantly, yet the cabin felt perhaps 40 degrees inside. He wore his coat indoors. Henrik had been working in his shirt sleeves all winter. By April, when the spring thaw arrived, Henrik had documented everything his cabin did well. Heat retention exceeded his predictions. The elevated platform kept the floor dry and eliminated ground cold entirely. The curved walls showed no stress from wind or snow load. The sod roof had not leaked once despite heavy snowfall. What Henrik didn't have was proof that his design could handle extreme conditions. The winter of 1898 had been mild, pleasant even. His barrel-walled cabin was over-engineered for the weather it had experienced. Other trappers pointed this out repeatedly. Henrik had spent 14 months and significant money building a fortress to survive conditions that never arrived. He needed a real test. He needed a storm that would break conventional cabins and prove his curved walls weren't just adequate, but necessary. February 9, 1899 began with perfect stillness. Henrik checked his trap lines at dawn and noticed the absolute absence of wind. The air felt heavy, pressed down by some invisible weight. Birds were silent. The creek flowed without its usual sound. Henrik had experienced this atmospheric pressure before. It meant a major storm was approaching, likely within 24 hours. By evening, the temperature had dropped to -30. Henrik brought extra firewood inside, stacking it near his fireplace. He filled every container with water from the creek. He secured his window shutter and checked the door seal. These were standard preparations. What happened over the next 5 days would be anything but standard. February 10th brought snow, not the light flakes of typical winter storms, but heavy wet snow that fell so densely Henrik couldn't see 20 feet from his window. Wind began around noon, starting at perhaps 20 miles per hour and increasing steadily through the afternoon. By nightfall, the wind was strong enough that Henrik could hear it pressing against his curved walls. The sound was different from what he remembered in conventional cabins. Instead of the battering ram impact of wind hitting flat surfaces, he heard a sliding, deflecting sound as air moved up and around the barrel shape. February 11th brought conditions unlike anything Henrik had experienced in 11 years on the frontier. He woke at dawn to wind that shook even his robust structure. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that made thinking difficult. He looked through his small window and saw nothing but white. Not falling snow, but snow being driven horizontally by wind that Henrik estimated exceeded 80 miles per hour. The interior of his cabin remained calm. Henrik's thermometer showed 52 degrees despite the fire having died to coals overnight. He rebuilt the fire slowly, conserving his indoor wood supply. Outside, the wind continued to increase. By mid-morning, it had reached what Henrik guessed was 100 miles per hour. The curved walls vibrated slightly but showed no sign of structural stress. Snow couldn't accumulate against them. The barrel shape caused it to slide downward and blow away. Around noon, during a brief moment when the wind dropped slightly, Henrik saw movement in the valley below. He pressed his face to the window and watched James Corbett's cabin 2 miles distant. The structure was barely visible through the blowing snow, but Henrik could make out its rectangular shape. As he watched, the north wall bowed inward. Then the roof collapsed. The entire cabin folded in on itself under the combined weight of snow and force of wind. The destruction took perhaps 10 seconds from first failure to complete collapse. Henrik stepped back from the window. Inside his barrel-walled cabin, the temperature held steady. The fire burned peacefully. The walls stood solid. Outside, the worst blizzard in recorded American history was destroying everything built using conventional methods. Henrik's strange curved walls, mocked for 3 years as pointless and impractical, were performing exactly as he had designed them to perform. The validation he had needed was happening. The cost was going to be measured in lives. The blizzard continued without pause for 3 days. Henrik maintained his fire, rationed his food, and waited. The wind never dropped below what he estimated was 70 miles per hour. Visibility remained 0. The temperature outside stayed near -40. These were killing conditions. Anyone call aught. Outside would die within minutes. Anyone in a failed structure would freeze before they could reach help. Henrik thought about James Corbett. He had watched Corbett's cabin collapse on February 11th. That was 2 days ago. If Corbett had survived the initial collapse, he might have made it to another trapper's cabin, or he might be dead. There was no way to know and no way to help during the storm. On February 13th, the wind decreased slightly, still dangerous, still blowing at perhaps 50 miles per hour, but no longer the sustained hurricane force of the previous days. Henrik was eating a cold lunch of dried meat when he heard something that didn't belong to the storm, a rhythmic thumping sound. 3 slow beats, pause, 3 more beats. Someone was knocking on his door. Henrik unbarred the door and pulled it open against the wind. A snow-covered figure collapsed across his threshold. Henrik dragged the person inside and forced the door closed. It took him a moment to recognize Daniel Moss under the ice-crusted beard and frozen clothing. The young trapper was conscious but hypothermic, his lips blue and his hands locked into claws. Henrik stripped off Moss's frozen outer clothing and wrapped him in blankets near the fire. He heated water and made Moss drink it slowly. For the first hour, Moss couldn't speak coherently. He shivered violently and mumbled words Henrik couldn't understand. Gradually, as his core temperature rose, the shivering decreased and speech returned. "My cabin collapsed yesterday morning," Moss said. "Walls folded in. I got out before the roof came down. Tried to reach Pike's place, found his cabin crushed under snow. Walked for hours. Couldn't see anything. Found your walls? Because I walked into them." "You walked blind through a blizzard for hours?" Henrik asked. "I walked or I died," Moss said. "Kept moving. Hit your wall on the south side. Followed it around to the door." He looked around the cabin interior, noting the warmth and stability. "Your walls are curved." "Yes?" "Everyone said you were crazy." Moss held his hands toward the fire. "I'm alive because you were crazy." They waited out the final day of the storm together. Henrik shared his food supplies. Moss examined the curved wall construction from inside, running his fingers along the smooth timbers and asking technical questions about how Henrik had calculated the angles. He understood now what Henrik had built and why it mattered. The wind finally stopped on February 14th, just after dawn. Henrik opened his door to a world transformed by snow and destruction. Drifts rose 15 feet in places. The temperature had climbed to -10, almost warm compared to the previous days. Smoke rose from a few distant chimneys. Most showed nothing. Henrik and Moss prepared to discover how many hadn't survived. The devastation became clear over the following week. 7 cabins within 20 miles of Henrik's location had been destroyed completely. 3 more were damaged badly enough to be uninhabitable. James Corbett had survived by burrowing into his collapsed cabin and creating a snow cave from the debris. He had frostbite on 3 fingers but would recover. William Cross, a homesteader with a wife and 2 children, had not been as fortunate. His cabin collapsed on February 11th. His family froze to death before the storm ended. Henrik and Daniel Moss spent 2 weeks helping survivors. They distributed supplies, helped clear debris, and provided temporary shelter for those who had lost everything. Everyone who saw Henrik's barrel-walled cabin standing intact and undamaged understood immediately what had happened. The design that had been mocked as circus tent construction had survived conditions that destroyed conventional building. By spring of 1899, 3 trappers asked Henrik to teach them his curved wall technique. He spent that summer helping Samuel Pike, Robert Duncan, and Thomas Chen build their own barrel-walled cabins. The work was slow and required patience, but all 3 structures were completed before winter. Henrik charged nothing for his advice. He wanted people to survive. That was the entire point. James Corbett never apologized for the mockery, but he stopped telling jokes about Henrik's building methods. He rebuilt his own cabin using modified techniques that incorporated some of Henrik's ideas about wind deflection and thermal mass. It wasn't a full barrel design, but it was better than what he had built before. By 1902, 12 barrel-walled cabins existed across Montana and Wyoming territories. The design variations reflected individual builders' skills and available materials, but the core principles remained consistent. Curved walls to deflect wind, elevated platforms to prevent ground cold, heavy sod roofs for insulation. The techniques Henrik had developed saved lives during severe winters in 1904 and 1907. Henrik continued trapping until 1906. He married Margaret Evanston in 1907 after she sold her trading post and moved to a small ranch near Helena. They had no children. Henrik worked the ranch quietly, raising cattle and staying far from the mountains that had nearly killed him multiple times. He rarely spoke about the great blizzard or the cabin he had built. In 1912, Henrik died at age 53 from pneumonia. Margaret buried him in Helena's cemetery under a simple stone that listed his name and dates. There was no mention of engineering or innovation. To anyone reading that stone, Henrik Larsson was just another frontiersman who had lived and died in Montana Territory. But his cabin still stood in the mountains. The Forest Service discovered it in 1923 and used it as a ranger station for 6 years. The curved walls remained solid. The sod roof still shed snow. The elevated platform kept the interior dry. Rangers who used the structure wrote in their logs about its unusual construction and remarkable warmth. One noted that it seemed built by someone who understood weather better than most engineers. The cabin stood until 1941, when a forest fire finally consumed it. By then, Henrik had been dead 29 years, and no one remembered his name or what he had proven about survival and engineering on the American frontier.